This event is funded in part by a grant from the Broward College Student Life Department. This event is part of the Steam Visiting Artist Series, which is now in its 5th year and has expanded to South and Central campuses. The series features prominent, nationally recognized contemporary artists that work in cross-disciplinary formats and incorporate groundbreaking new approaches to material and process. You'll notice that there's one more lecture this semester. Next month we have one more in the series, and we hope you'll consider returning for that. Our speaker tonight is Ani Liu, a research-based artist working at the intersection of art and science. Annie earned a BA from Dartmouth College and a Master's of Architecture from the Harvard Graduate School of Design and a Master of Science from the MIT Media Lab. Her work has been presented internationally and featured on National Geographic, Vice, TED Talks, Core 77, PC Mag, Fox, Wired, and more, as well as exhibited at Ars Electronica, the Queen's Museum Biennial, Boston Museum of Fine Arts, the Asian Art Museum, MIT Media Lab, Manning Contemporary, Harvard University, and Shenzhen Design Society. Annie is also the winner of the Princeton Arts Fellowship, the SNR Washington Prize, the Biological Art and Design Award, and was awarded first place in the UFAB Global Creative Awards. She is currently teaching at the Harvard Graduate School of Design and is on critique panels at Harvard, Dartmouth, MIT, University of Pennsylvania, NYU, UNC Charlotte, Pratt, and Parsons. Annie has her research-based art specifically examines the reciprocal relationships between science and technology and their resulting impact on human subjectivity, culture, and identity. She is fascinated by the dilemmas that result from scientific and technological breakthroughs, exploring social, cultural, and ethical implications of emerging technologies, continually seeking what it means to be human in a technologically mediated age. Her process utilizes playful experimentation, intuition, and speculative storytelling, exploring themes of the subconscious, longing, nostalgia, and memory. In search to link scientific innovation with emotional tangibility, her work has spanned the scales of architectural installations, robotics, wearable prosthetics, perfumes, augmented reality, and synthetic biology. We're honored that Annie came from New York City to be with us tonight, and I look forward to hearing more insight into her work. Please welcome Ani Liu.
Thank you so much for having me. So ever since I was pretty much a little kid, I've always wanted to be an artist, and I've always been kind of nerdy and geeky. And now I get to make art with the tools of science, and it's literally my dream come true. So thank you so much for letting me share my work with you. As Lisa mentioned, I'm an artist that often makes work in the laboratory using the tools of science and technology to investigate themes that I think artists have always investigated. Things like sexuality, nostalgia, longing, what it means to be human. At the core of my work, I believe that while we shape our technologies co-shape us. And this feedback loop is something that I like to examine. But first I wanted to zoom back a little bit, like as an introduction to myself and some background. I grew up in Chinatown, New York City, to immigrant parents. And pretty much as long as I can remember, I've always worked 3 or 5 jobs. I've always been in love with art though, and as an attempt to kind of bridge my love for aesthetics with something practical, I went to architecture school. And so I went to architecture school at Harvard, and it was one of the most intense experiences ever. I think I only slept every other day. And the school is so hierarchical that the architecture reflects it. Like 4th year students sit on the top and they look down on the 1st year students. And I really loved learning how to make things with new technology. So like it was my first time using a laser cutter, a 3D printer, a CNC. It was my first time learning how to communicate my ideas through 3D models and to mediate the process of design through not just like drawing with my body, but like literally clicking for hours with one finger. But you can probably tell from my desk that I wasn't that interested in architecture. I was more interested in basically strapping computers to my face around the time that I graduated. The Oculus Rift had just come out, and I tried VR for the first time. Google Glass had just come out, and Harvard had a set, so I like put myself on a giant wait list to wear it. And in addition, I made a lot of my own versions because I was like, how does this work? Can I make one? Can I have my mom try it? So for me, as a newly minted architect, I was really intrigued by the future of VR and what it would mean for how we experience space or socialize or how we relate to the built environment. And I wrote my thesis about that. And after my thesis, I was invited back to teach a studio based on these ideas on the impact of wearable technology in public space. And I also got to run a small research group called Sensory Mediation at the Harvard Center for Green Buildings and Cities. And so we were researching things like, can wearable tech make people have more sustainable behaviors? So for instance, instead of heating or cooling an entire office building, in which men are always too hot because they have to wear suits and women are always too cold because we biologically have different needs, what if you wore something on your wrist that heated and cooled you more locally? Or does the perception of the color on the wall change the way you feel the climate inside? So we did research like that, and just kind of like one thing led to another, and I met Hiromi Ozaki, who was running a research group at MIT Media Lab, and I decided to go there the following year. And I was part of a group called Design Fiction, which was really just so serendipitously perfect for me. It was a group that combined art, design, science. They like to say they're between science fiction and science fact. And so there, I was lucky enough to study. It's funny, I thought that I would continue my research in wearable tech, but instead, all the scientists there were like, wearable tech is dead, DNA editing is the new wearable tech, so I learned a lot about synthetic biology and the kind of future interfaces of bio while keeping in mind ethical and social implications of this kind of research. And I'll talk more about that later. But that brings me to today, where I've moved back to New York City, trying to make it as an artist while continuing to research and teach. So as I mentioned, I'm an artist that often makes work in a laboratory using the tools of science and technology. And I wanted to start with one of my lifelong fascinations, which is with perception. And I think it's a good place to start because I think a lot about the impacts of technology on society. And I think perception has a lot to do with it. So perception is really interesting because we know from cognitive science that what our eyes see and the world we perceive are actually really different. This is your retina and how it sees. There's blood vessels all over the place, like all in the way of our sensors. There's a blind spot. The part of your eye that's actually very high resolution and sensitive to color is only about the size of 2 thumbs held arm's distance away. So like pretty much the rest of your reality, your brain has to make up. Like your eye moves around all the time and it samples reality, and then your brain builds a picture of it. So we're constantly extending and completing with our minds. We fill in color where there's no color, we fill in shapes where we don't have shapes, and that's how a lot of visual illusions work. So your brain has to build you a trustworthy reality based on sensory input. We generate perceptions. So to prove to myself, first with these first few points back in grad school, I designed a set of glasses to recreate the principle of perceptual adaptation, which George M. Stratton discovered back in 1890. And it works like this. So this is a pair of glasses that let you see the world upside down. They're made out of mirrored acrylic. And so if you wear these glasses, you see the world upside down. And if you are forced to wear them for 3 days straight, which they made students do in an experiment, after 3 days, you actually see everything right side up again, because that's what your mind knows. So pretty much what your retina see and the world we perceive is different. What you actually perceive is always filtered by your cognition, and after 3 days, your brain would take over and re-scramble the input by your upside-down eyes and write it back up again, because that's what it knows. And what's interesting is this doesn't just happen when you wear upside-down goggles. Your cognition is always running, always adapting what you see to what it thinks you ought to see. The raw data of sensory input is always filtered by your mind before it becomes what we perceive. So what's interesting is that these priming effects don't just work on image recognition, it works on mood and behavior and all kinds of other things. So they did this other experiment where they asked people to put a pencil in their mouth, and after 1 minute they asked you to rate your mood, and after 1 minute you would rate your mood as better because you activated the same muscles as smiling, your zygomatic muscles. body thinks it's like calm and doing well. So I kind of became interested in this idea of embodied cognition. So perception is a fabrication of our mind. We're constantly building a version of reality based on what we perceive through our senses, and cognition is always being shaped by our context. And what's really interesting, though, is that we're living in a time where most of the things we perceive, a lot of those things that make that priming context, are constructions that we built ourselves. So there's a feedback loop between the world changing us and us changing the world. We shape our tools and our tools shape us, which is a really famous quote by media theorist Marshall. So people are always claiming that technology is going to save the world or destroy the world, and the fact is you can probably find valid claims to prove both sides of the statement. Because we as humans and culture and technology exist in this really complex weave, always changing and going together. We're in collaboration all the time. So I'm going to extend this beyond technology and say that science is also just as instrumental as shaping our plastic subjectivities. So it's broadly accepted that science provides foundations for our knowable or phenomenal truths. But for instance, when Darwin first suggested the theory of evolution, it was condemned because of the radical way that such an observation would challenge the stories of the church. So it's because scientific revolutions don't just describe new information. As humans, they often alter our societal norms and our sense of self. Like, for instance, what happens if, instead of all the history of paintings of self-portraits, I told you that now all self-portraits could be in the form of data or a circuit. And so as a researcher, designer, and artist, I became really obsessed with this. I think that almost every break of the foundations that we construct a reality with, from perception to technology to science itself, shapes our subjectivities and is shaped by them in the making. So I feel like as an artist, as a designer, as a technologist, we construct these contexts, and that this is a responsibility that we can frame the realities. So a few examples of how design can reveal frameworks is this chair by Edgar Oleneta. When I look at this image, the fact that objects impose silent culture of its design comes to the surface. Design itself is always framing, and in this case, we realize that ergonomics dictates an acceptable range of norms. It's only when we're outside that norm, when we're too tall or too wide or too small or too dark or too other, for instance. There's a lot of issues with computer vision not detecting non-white faces. That's when those transparent interfaces slide away and reveal embedded assumptions. Another strategy that designers use to reveal invisible frameworks is by constructing designs for conditions that have no interface. So this is a piece by Jennifer Kukri called Power Pose, and it's like the classic CEO like body language. And so I thought it was really interesting by making all this jewelry that indicates certain poses. She highlights how sometimes your body language communicates more than your words, and the way you position your body can influence things like your behavior and mood, but we don't often think about that until there's a thing that reveals the embedded information. So I started to realize that there's no such thing as neutral design. Objects seldom have just a solely practical significance. They carry ritual and symbolic meaning. Can you imagine what it would say about the culture of work-life balance if the first day of work this was your standard keyboard? It means that you will never have work-life balance. Like, your boss expects you to eat and work and do everything while working. And I love objects like this that artists and designers make because there's companies like Samsung and Google dictating the kind of design needs that we should all have, right? Can you imagine what people would say if you didn't have a smartphone or an email address? This is what we have decided is what it means to be human now. Like, this is, I think, Pope Francis's first day on the job, and everyone is there to greet him with their bodies, but also with their devices. So as an artist, I think that we need to insert design objects into the world that serve alternate purposes to raise questions. So I thought, so this is one of the first things I ever made. It's a pair of goggles that let you swap vision with someone else. I made this in 2013, so it's a long time ago and it's really low tech. But I was thinking, at the time I was reading a lot of media theory written in the 70s about the future of the internet. And they talked about how, in the future everyone will live in a global village and trends will spread super fast, and as soon as people in Japan think that this thing is so cool, people in, Canada will also. And of course we live in that time now, and I was just thinking, if if we're all extensions of each other in this networked, tethered landscape, what is it like to actually sensorially be networked? What if we swapped one of our organs or our sensory organs? So these are two elements that let you swap vision. And it's interesting because if I had your eyes and you had my eyes, you're actually kind of blind. You would just start walking into things. But I found that if I wore it for a long time, like an hour with someone, we actually did become kind of symbiotic. Like if I walked into a trash can, you would whip your head towards the sound of the trash can, and then I would see myself running into a trash can. And it was really interesting to be part of a networked body. And so this was part of the exploration, if we live in this collective organism of a convergent mind through the internet, cybernetics, and other technologies, what does this mean for subjectivity, and what kind of art reflects that, what kind of design reflects that, and I wanted to make a new kind of interactive art that could allow me to reflect these conditions. So this was one of the projects that I made in architecture school, and then afterwards I taught this class called Cultural Prosthetics to kind of get students to think in this way. And these are some of the projects by the students. This is a project by Priscilla Capellonis, and she created this wearable that had all these like spines, and they would point to surveillance cameras. So if she walked down the street, it would constantly point at different surveillance cameras on the street. And she wanted to question and expose frameworks of surveillance. And it's super interesting because I think now she works at Google, which is like the ultimate surveillance company. But I'm glad that she has some critical design training. This is by Shante Butler, and she created a bridge railing that's embedded with bone conduction speakers. So you don't hear anything unless you put your hands on it, and then your bones vibrate, so you hear a message. And it only activates if you push so hard that it thinks that you're about to jump off, and then it gives you suggestions on like therapy hotlines and things like that. And then this one is by Josh Zhao, and he was exploring empathy between different races, genders, and differences. So it's kind of an interesting project where the person wearing it is wearing this projector, and it would project the face of an other. So like it might project the face of a woman or a black person onto a white man, and then you could see yourself in the mirror that he's wearing, and you would have a conversation on differences with your face, kind of assuming an identity of another. So as I mentioned, after that, I ended up at the Media Lab, and I was part of this group called Design Fiction. And as some of you might know, design fiction is a sister term to speculative design. And speculative design is a kind of way to create, it's almost like science fiction. Use design to ask questions and to imagine alternate futures, to kind of bring to light the ethical implications of certain technologies. So for instance, if I was designing cosmetics, I would ask, what if my makeup wasn't just to make me pretty, but also protected me from facial recognition algorithms? So this is a project by Adam Harvey where he designed the makeup to specifically cover proportions on your face that computer vision uses to detect your face. So it's both like kind of cool and cyberpunk, and also protects you from CV. And then also like, what if instead of just attracting a suitor, your manicure would actually inform you if a lover is genetically compatible with you by collecting some of his cells? And more importantly, the whole point of design fiction is what kind of world would that be, right? Like what if this is just some future where this is standard? What does that mean for all of us? So at MIT, I was actually lucky enough to work with scientists that actually worked in cutting-edge fields that sounded like science fiction. Like literally they had labs called synthetic neurobiology, sculpted evolution. I talked to everyone who worked from artificial intelligence to artificial life. And all across campus, I think there are just brilliant scientists working in their lab to make the world a better place. And part of what my group asked is, what is better? What is better for you, for me, for a black woman, a gay man, a retired veteran, a kindergartner with a learning disability? I think it's the role of artists and designers to raise critical questions, and art is how we can see and feel the future. And I feel incredibly lucky because today is a really extraordinary time to be a designer, with all the new tools becoming accessible. For instance, the new field of synthetic biology seeks to write biology by making it a design problem. And this is a kit by a friend of mine, Julie Legault, and it's called Amino, which allows like pretty much students or artists or DIY. It's kind of like the Arduino of synthetic biology. So this kit has like a PCR and a few other lab equipment that helps you genetically engineer things like E. coli or yeast. So like from this kit you can make yeast that smells like bananas or like E. coli, turn different colors depending on the temperature and things like that. So through these developments, the group that I was in asked what is the role and responsibilities of a designer, a scientist, or a businessman in these emerging fields, and what kind of possibilities do they offer? What are the current and future implications of genetic engineering, synthetic biology, and how are they changing our perceptions of the self, society, and evolution? What kind of humans will we be in the future, and what are the stakes in this game? So, as you know, I was doing all of this research about humans, machines, cyborgs, and like pretty much wearable tech, and then I got to MIT, and they were like, digital is dead, bio is the new digital. So I literally took everything from like Bio 1 to like graduate level courses and intro to synthetic biology, and I joined this biohacking club where I started to learn a new language, and I asked myself, what are the important things about making art with life itself? So I got unleashed into a wet lab, and I started by learning how to genetically engineer E. coli to turn the same color as my nail polish. I learned how to grow bacteria from different parts of my body, and I learned how to read and sequence them. And as an artist, I wanted to learn about these things more intuitively, and so at the Biohacking Club, a bunch of friends and I decided to create pretty much like an LP, like a record player that made music from our microbiome. So I designed this giant petri dish in the shape of an LP, and then we would like swab different parts of our body and grow on it. So basically think of that as a giant petri dish. So we would use computer vision to create music from our microbiome. So like you can see from the top, those are the cultures, and depending on the color, the shape, the size of the cultures, we would give them different qualities of like sonification. And because it's MIT and we're nerds, we would DJ them at parties. And in a way, I thought it was really interesting. It was kind of like an interspecies synesthesia. How can we understand something through a different modality, right? Like, can we process data through more embodied forms of cognition? Would we recognize more patterns of the biology if we sonify them? Of course, like, we could take the same data and graph them or write about them, but we wanted to like kind of almost like anti-intuitively hear them. And so you could, like, if I plated a petri dish with my bacteria, it would definitely sound very different from yours because we're all unique. So it's like kind of an interesting experiment. So after I learned a bit of biohacking, I started to dream up bigger projects, and I thought to myself, what if you could like take a selfie? I was like, can I encapsulate my own natural body scent and send it to a lover? And actually I was super ambitious, and I was like, I'm gonna grow a flower that smells like me. And I was doing this research, and funny enough, I found that it was a 19th century Austrian tradition. Couples in courtship would keep a slice of apple in their armpit during dances, and at the end of the evening, the girl would give the used fruit to a guy she liked, and if he liked her back, he would eat it. And famously, Napoleon wrote lots of love letters to Josephine. Perhaps the most memorable is this one that says, "Home in 3 days, don't bathe." And both Napoleon and Josephine loved violets. She wore violets in her perfume, carried violets on their wedding day, and Napoleon sent her a bouquet of violets every year on their anniversary. And when she died, Napoleon planted violets on her grave. And just before his exile, he made a pilgrimage to this grave, took some of those violets, put them in a locket, and he wore it around his neck until the day he died. And I kind of wondered, like, what if I could have grown that violet to smell just like Josephine? What if for the rest of eternity, when you went to go visit her grave, you could smell Josephine just as Napoleon loved her? Could we design a new way of mourning, new rituals for remembering? After all, we have genetically engineered like transgenic crops to be maximized for profit. Crops that stand up to transport, crops that have long shelf life, crops that taste really sweet but resist pests, sometimes crops that have specific shapes that are easier for packing. So can we harness these same capitalist-driven technologies approaches to design for emotional output. So this inspiration launched me into this journey of researching questions like, what makes a person smell like a person? It turns out it's a super complicated question. Many factors, including your diet, your medications, your clothes, your lifestyle, all factor into the way you smell. I found out that sweat is mostly odorless, but it's the bacteria in your microbiome that's responsible for so much of your smells. Mood, identity, and all kinds of things, but there are all kinds of molecules that your bodies emit, but which we only perceive subconsciously, and I became really interested in this. So I started collecting and cataloging the bacteria from different sites of my body. At some point, really naively, I thought maybe the perfect, if I had to recreate my smell, maybe it's like 10% collarbone, 3% belly button, 50% armpit, things like that. So I was growing all this bacteria. And then occasionally I would let other researchers from the lab take a whiff of my sample, and it was really interesting to see how smell is experienced divorced from the context of my body. So people would say things like, it smells like flowers, or chicken, or cornflakes, or beef carnitas, which is really diverse given that these cultures were all bred from my body. So that research failed spectacularly. After 2 years of research, I never did grow a flower that smelled like me. But it's something that I think artists and scientists share, that to make progress you have to try, experiment, and fail a lot. And I think it's important to share successes of the stories of struggle. So this one was a huge struggle, but it branched into a few different projects, and I wanted to share those with you. So first I was learning a lot about the microbiome, which is the trillions of microorganisms that live on your skin, in your gut, on your tongue, like everywhere, pretty much like for every 10 cells you have, 9 of them are a different organism. So the microbiome is really interesting because it's a field of science that we actually don't know a lot about yet, and we're still doing a lot of research. But this particular paper was one of the first that I read, and it was really interesting. It's from the Farm-Cone Family Digestive Health Institute, and the research is like this. They took mice, and they C-sectioned them out of the mother. So these mice were kind of like bubble mice. They had no bacteria ever touched them. And what they would do is that they would put the bacteria of an aggressive mouse, a depressed mouse, or an anxious mouse on this baby mouse that had no bacteria. And then the baby would become depressed, anxious, or aggressive, which was super interesting because up until this point, I always understood everything as nature versus nurture, right? Like maybe you're anxious because you grew up in a war-torn country, or you're anxious because you have the genetic disposition for it. But the idea that you could be XYZ because you have organisms that live on you or in you that cause these behavioral attributes, I thought was really interesting. So as a weirdo, I was like, I have to go kiss every Nobel laureate on campus and like basically lick their whole body because I want their microbiome. And I didn't, but I was thinking about like, what are the many things that make up someone's identity, their culture, their childhood, their constructed gender, and perhaps now all these other organisms. And I started to think, we have a long history of self-portraits. Artists have been making self-portraits for all of time, and I was like, what does a contemporary self-portrait look like, and how can I include these other life forms? So I've been making these self-portraits where I take a mold of a part of my face or body, so in this instance, my lips, and then I would plate them with bacteria from that part of my body. So in this case, I kissed it, and then all of these things grew from it. And part of what I was interested in is how does the idea of me and the idea of other exist now that I know that so many entities co-make the single mutating entity that is us and me. And beyond the interesting science, I find the emotional and cultural impacts of the notion of a deconstructed identity really powerful. Jane Bennett is a writer that wrote this beautiful book called Vibrant Matter, and her radical argument is that everything is alive, interconnected, and in process. Not just plants and humans, but even rocks and air. And so, according to this, and something that I've been really interested in, is that there's no such thing as objects or subjects from a certain perspective, that they and we are never entirely passive or stable, that they're crystallizations of a process, and that everything is in process, constantly undergoing transformation, constantly undergoing modification. So another project that came from the Smell Feed project was a series of perfume So while I wasn't able to fully engineer a plant to smell like me, I did create a protocol to create perfumes that smelled like specific people. And I think part of my interest was that, the design space has been really kind of like prevalently, it has a lot to do with augmented reality and virtual reality and digital experiences. And I myself spend a lot of my working days in front of a screen, and I think that I often crave getting back to some animal part of me. And I think when I started learning a lot about smell, it really helped. So smell is incredibly emotional. It has direct neurological pathways to memory. Art historian Caroline Jones says really beautifully that smell is pre-verbal and has no capacity to pretend. And I think we've all had that experience that even before you recognize what the smell is, you have the emotional flashbacks of what it triggers. And I find it really lovely because when you smell a molecule of something, unlike sight, like when you see something, a photon of light hits that thing and then reflects off that thing into your retina and then your brain scrambles it up. But actually when you smell something, a molecule of that thing binds onto your receptor and becomes a part of you. So it's really disgusting when it's like dog shit and a piece of dog shit is part of you now. And it's really beautiful when it's your lover and you're merging into a one entity. And so for me, the Human Perfume series is not just, it's kind of an attempt to capture ephemeral feelings. It's a negotiation between myself as a hormonal, impulsive animal and myself as a cultured, thinking, planning, rational being, because the work itself was super emotionally driven, but in order to make it, I had to constantly be in a really clinical lab where I had to be clean all the time and make tons of calculations. And so I think it was an interesting kind of tension. And then a third project that came out of this research was, when I was making this project, I was in an 8-year long distance relationship. So smell was very personal for me, and something that my partner and I were doing to help bridge the gap was that once a week we would try to cook the same meal together over Skype so that we would smell and taste the same thing as we did the same thing. And I was thinking there's some people in even longer distance relationships, like astronauts to Earth. And around that time, MIT Media Lab just started a space initiative, so I got to talk to astronauts a lot, which was really interesting. So I created this object. It's kind of a speculative design object, but it also exists and it works. I created this sensory token where an astronaut could bring 3 smells of Earth that they loved. So it's like the smell of a person that they love, the smell of their home, and the smell of a natural resource like the ocean or the forest. And I tried different kind of prototypes, but I got to experience this on a zero gravity flight, so I actually got to go on a shuttle and float around smelling Earth. And I was also hooked up to a ton of sensors to see if, while I was in zero gravity, which is kind of a stressful experience, whether smelling Earth would calm me down. It didn't, but it was very fun nonetheless. So yeah, I was thinking about, there's going to be a time where we take one-way trips out of Earth, and that there will be new kind of immigrants to space. And in addition to the gigabytes of photographs and information that we bring about Earth into space, what about the sensory ones, right? We have the golden record where we have the Earth's most important music etched into a platinum record. And I was thinking, what about the golden record of smells? What would we want to remember of Earth? So it's just a thought. And so one other thing that I find really interesting about smell is that while all of your sensory input, sight, touch, sound, goes through your thalamus first in your brain, the sense of smell doesn't. It goes straight to the olfactory bulb, which is part of the more ancient system. So it means that, number one, that's why smell is so emotional. It's part of your limbic system. But also, it means that smell bypasses the thalamus, so you can experience it while you sleep. And it's really interesting because they did these studies where they did the study on people who were trying to quit smoking, and they would do it like this. The participants would fall asleep, and then they would emit the smell of cigarette smoke, and then they would emit either a very pleasant smell, like smell of flowers, or a really disgusting smell, like the smell of vomit. And then the participants would wake up, and they would not remember at all that they smelled anything. None of them reported that they smelled anything in their sleep. but the group that smelled something disgusting after the smell of cigarette smokes quit smoking much easier. So it's kind of new research still, but they think it's a way that you can subliminally impact behavior, which I think is so interesting. So smell is still quite understudied, but has a really big implication to us because we are evolved as animals. So while I was reading about these subliminal cues within smell research, I looked a lot at the subconscious and it became something I was really interested in. And so there's this history of separating the rational from the emotionally driven irrational. But there's new research that shows that emotions are really important in many domains, including reasoning, problem-solving, decision-making. And so this was one of the studies that I found really interesting. It's called the somatic marker hypothesis. And they discovered it like this. You play this card game, there's 4 decks of cards, you get money if you get a high card. So in human studies, that's a really big motivator. What you don't know is that the decks are not evenly distributed. There's some decks that are a lot more favorable. And it takes you between 60 and 80 cards to figure out, like, this is the deck I should take from. But actually, within 10 cards, your palms start to sweat when you reach for a bad deck. And so this was really interesting to the scientists because there's something that your emotional system recognizes in the environment and the pattern before your prefrontal cortex does. So a friend and I learned about this and we were like, that's interesting. We wonder if we can hack it. So we created this really simple system where we put a galvanic skin sensor, which is a sensor that detects when you sweat, and an LED. So we were like, every time you have a galvanic skin response, like when your palms get sweaty, this LED will go off and you'll know that it's a bad deck. So we ran the study again. And it turns out that when you know you're stressed, you just get more stressed. And so like it was really interesting. And also all of our participants were MIT students and they're like totally not a normal distribution because the first person in our study didn't sweat at all, and we were like, oh my god, our sensor is broken, and we debugged it, and we checked every part of our circuit, and then we talked to that guy, and it turns out he's like a famous classical pianist, and he trained himself not to sweat when he's nervous, so like he just didn't have a sweaty palm response, and we were like, oh my god. And then like another person that we tested is a professional game designer, and he immediately recognized the pattern that we were using for the game. He was like, oh, you're just using this algorithm. But all in all, we did discover that once people discover that they're sweaty and like, so people did try to use it like a weather stick, you know, to protect whether the deck was good or bad, but once you know it doesn't work. But still, I think that this experiment is interesting because we do know that there's something that your emotional brain recognizes in the environment that your prefrontal cortex doesn't. And I think all artists here kind of know that. Like you all have gut feelings and you all know sometimes like something's wrong, but you don't know why yet. So this experiment kind of failed, but I'm still interested in kind of playing with these systems. So reading a bunch of scientific papers about emotional cognition led me to ask, is it possible to, you know, I was like, okay, can we use these studies to make the future of art? Art is usually comprised of like some kind of aesthetic experience, like looking at a painting or experiencing a sculpture and then having maybe like an emotional response. So a bunch of friends and I were like, can we bypass aesthetics completely and just program emotions directly into your brain through science? So we created this thing we call the affective induction style, where we tried to program happiness into the participants directly. And so like, we use things like, for instance, as you know from the experiment I showed before, when you hold a pencil in your mouth, you think that your mood is improved because you activate your smiling muscles. So we built this thing that made people put their face in a smile. We also found that, like, you know, if you take a placebo pill, you're more likely to believe that your symptoms are alleviated even when you know it's a placebo pill. So we would give them a placebo pill for happiness and we would tell them it's a placebo, but that placebos work. And then they would take them. We flashed a specific hertz of light that is correlated with euphoria. We read the 50 most affectively positively rated words. We electrocuted their hand into a thumbs up sign. And we paid like a third-party company to add 1,000 followers onto their Instagram account. And then at the end, we ended it with like a selfie. white cells. How reducible are we to flesh and neurons to measurements? It was a performance piece in which neuroscience and art were converged to question these thresholds between the mind, body, aesthetics, and emotional experiences. And then this project's a little bit different, it diverges, but I was using a lot of EEGs in this project where I was measuring brain waves, and I had an opportunity to visit a factory in China. I got this grant to do technological innovation in a factory in Shenzhen, and it was a knitting factory. So I was writing a little bit of code to help them make new products, but secretly I wanted to do a piece about labor. And I learned a lot about knitting at that time, and I found knitting to be really interesting because it's not just a functional technology, but it also expresses many aspects of being human, historically, culturally, emotionally. Knitting involves all these complex protocols and carries the signature of the maker. Unlike machines, humans have really unique quirks, and I still have all these sweaters that my grandmother knit for me before I was even born. And they're kind of funny because you can see where she was watching TV and she totally lost track because there'd be like weird, bunchy parts of it, or like parts where there's holes, but I love it because it kind of embodies a moment in time of her. And so, you know, with the proliferation of automation in factories, mass-produced knits have totally standardized stitches that remove any mark of the maker. And so this is a knitting machine, and of course automation has many functions, but I was kind of wondering, is it possible to imbue automation with something as intimate as the mark of a brushstroke? So this project takes the cognitive quirks of a person, like the factory worker, through their EEG signals. So I use this thing called the Muse. It's a headband that has 4 sensors, and then it would translate them into the knitting process. So for instance, this is the EEG data from a period of work in the factory from a person. And then this is actually the knitting software. It's really interesting. You can see the little colored squares on the bottom. Each of them is kind of like a function. So like the red square means that you would stitch up and then down, and then like the green square would be like down and up, and then each of them carries a different protocol. So depending on the EEG signal, the tensility of the weaving would kind of reflect the mark of the person who made it. So if the worker was really tense, the stitch would be a little bit tenser, and when the worker was relaxed, it would be a little bit more relaxed. And pretty much like going to the factory was really interesting and shocking for me because it was kind of like being in the Matrix. Like I entered this building and it was just like hundreds and hundreds of machines. And for every like 20 machines, there would be one person. So these people would like sprint back and forth, tending to the machines, like fixing broken needles, threading it. And I just, you know, it was such a reversal of the human-machine relationship, and I really wanted to give a voice to the worker. And you know, like we all have manufactured clothes, and the labor is often anonymous. So I wanted to create this project to give a moment of self-reflection during production and stitch a portrait of the factory worker through their fluctuating moods throughout the day. And so each one is unique to the person making it and the moment that they made it. Which leads me to my last project. And it has to do with reproduction and gender rights. So 2 years ago, I think, when I made it, Donald Trump had said this, like, grab them by the pussy comment, and it was really infuriating to me as a woman. And then one of the first things that he passed was something that had to do with women's bodies, and it was just this famous photograph of like all these men signing a document that limited funding for reproductive choices. And so I had this response, and I was like, I made this device that lets me control sperm with my mind. I was in a class, a bio class, and I was learning that Stanford researchers could control paramecium with electric fields. So they would play Pong with this paramecium. And I thought it was so interesting because it's not a pixel, it's actually a living organism that they're treating like a pixel. And then I was like, I wonder if this works with sperm and what it means for a woman to control sperm. So I did some tests. All the while I was thinking about, you know, the history of female bodies and how they're often passive and objectified and often a kind of conduit for other kind of political messages. So I made this system and it works like this. I use a brain-computer interface which captures thoughts that I have, and then these electric signals would be translated through a microcontroller, and there would be a circuit under the microscope which would vary the electric field left and right, and then there would be a projector that projected it down. So with a microcontroller, you can translate the signals from your brain EEG to switch this electric field back and forth. It just moves at 12 volts per centimeter and send the sperm left and right depending on your thoughts. So why do this? What symbolic implications are there to a woman controlling sperm with her thoughts? What are some counter-narratives to a history of female reproduction being controlled predominantly by men? During the research for this project, I came across all kinds of things in the history of medicine and science, which, quote-unquote facts at the time were like described in really gendered language. For instance, you would hear about like sperm making the heroic journey to the passive egg, which of course we now know is very complicated and not passive at all. And then I would read things like, and once it was unfertilized, it would slough away like garbage. So it was really interesting to me throughout this project to kind of tease out objective truth that was colored by cultural subjectivity in the science itself. So I created this project to raise questions about the biopolitics of reproduction, bodies, gender, and control. If we're the stories we tell ourselves, how can I add some weirdness into the mix, and how might we reconsider the realm of the possible? So that gives you a little overview of some of my previous work and what I've been thinking about. And I often like to end with some of these thoughts that, there's something that I hope an audience of my work would take away is that there's no such thing as neutral design, there's no such thing as neutral tools, no neutral technology. Our perception of reality is always mediated by the very context that we're constructing for ourselves, which is why I think it's so important to have speculative design and counter-narratives. So this is a quote by Cedric Price that I often like to end with, that in today's day and age, we often look to technology as the immediate answer, but as an artist, designer, and speculative designer, I like to ask, what is the question? Thank you.